When I married Richard, I didn't expect to inherit such silence. His home, though beautiful, felt more like a display than a place where people lived. Every corner was too neat, too untouched. And then there was Jake, his 20-year-old son, tall, quiet, and polite in a way that made him seem much older. We were strangers forced to share meals, hallways, and a name neither of us chose. Jake rarely spoke more than necessary. I tried to initiate small talk, asking about school, work, or if he needed anything. He always answered kindly but briefly. Richard told me Jake was still processing the loss of his mother, who had passed away 2 years ago. I understood grief, but this was more like an invisible wall and I didn't know how to get past it. One Saturday, while Richard was out handling a business errand, I stayed home and decided to bake. The weather reminded me of my grandmother's kitchen back in Tennessee, the kind of day that called for pie. I pulled out her handwritten recipe for apple cinnamon pie and got to work, not thinking much of it. The house slowly filled with the familiar scent of baked apples and sugar, and I felt a tiny flicker of comfort in that kitchen. When Jake came in from outside, his expression shifted. He looked around like he was searching for something, and then his eyes landed on the pie cooling by the window. "That smell," he said quietly. I looked up, surprised he had spoken without being prompted. "It's my grandmother's recipe. I hope you like apple pie." He hesitated for a moment before sitting down at the kitchen counter. "My mom used to make the same pie. Not just apple pie, this exact scent. She added cinnamon like that too." His voice was softer than usual and I could see the layers start to peel back. I served him a slice without saying anything more. He took a bite and for the first time since I moved in I saw emotion on his face. Something vulnerable, almost like relief. "I haven't tasted this in years," he said. "It's like being back in our old house, before she got sick." I sat across from him, not wanting to interrupt whatever memory he was walking through. We ate quietly and for the first time it didn't feel awkward. It felt like two people sharing something that didn't need to be explained. After that he stayed in the kitchen a bit longer. We talked about how college didn't feel right yet, how he missed the way things used to be. I just listened. I didn't offer advice or push him to open up more. It was enough that he chose to speak. That night as I washed the dishes I realized something had shifted. Maybe it wasn't a breakthrough, but it was the first moment we'd truly seen each other. Not as strangers, not as replacements, but as people carrying pain, trying to make sense of new beginnings. After that day with the pie, something changed between us. Jake wasn't suddenly chatty or overly warm, but his walls had shifted. There were moments now, shared breakfasts, short conversations in the hallway, that didn't feel forced. He'd ask what I was cooking or offer to help carry groceries inside. These little things added up and I noticed myself looking forward to them more than I should have. One evening I found him outside working on the backyard shed. Without thinking I brought him a glass of lemonade and stayed to talk. He started telling me about his interest in mechanical design, how he'd always dreamed of restoring old motorcycles but never found the right push. I listened carefully and for the first time he seemed excited while speaking. I encouraged him to consider classes or workshops. His eyes lit up when I mentioned it, and he admitted he'd been thinking about school again but hadn't talked to anyone about it. It struck me how much he'd kept buried and how a small nudge could light something inside him. Over the next few weeks, we started working together on small projects. Painting the hallway, rearranging storage boxes, even planting a few flowers by the fence. We didn't talk much about emotions, but the comfort grew in the silence. He started making little jokes. He'd tease me about how I folded towels or how I hummed when I cooked. It wasn't flirtation, it was warmth. Familiarity. I knew that kind of comfort could be mistaken for something deeper, but I also knew how rare it was to feel understood. One night, a storm knocked out the power and we ended up in the living room with candles and hot tea. Richard was out of town again attending a real estate conference. Jake sat across from me, more relaxed than I'd ever seen him. We talked about music, books, and places we'd never been. At one point he looked at me and said, "You've made this place feel alive again. It was just a house before." That sentence lingered. I didn't know how to respond, so I just smiled. My chest felt tight. Not from fear but from how much I wanted him to feel okay. Wanted him to heal. That was all. Later as I was cleaning up I caught myself thinking about how natural it felt to be around him. How our rhythm had become so easy. But I reminded myself that I was his stepmother and lines had to be clear. Still, the emotions didn't fit neatly into boxes. I wasn't in love but I cared for him deeply. And I could see he cared too. We were two people brought together by circumstance, trying to find peace in an unfamiliar bond. It wasn't dramatic or inappropriate. It was simply real. Complicated. Human. And whether or not it led anywhere, I couldn't deny the closeness that had quietly taken root between us. Richard left for another short business trip, something that had become more frequent lately. I didn't think much of it anymore. Life had settled into a rhythm. That evening, Jake surprised me by saying he wanted to cook dinner. I laughed at first, assuming it was a joke, but he was serious. He'd been watching videos online, testing small recipes, and now he wanted to try something real. I sat at the table while he moved through the kitchen, awkward but determined. He made a simple pasta dish, and when we sat down to eat, he looked more proud than I'd ever seen him. I told him it was great, and it genuinely was. He smiled, not just politely but fully. That smile stayed with me. During dinner, he started talking about his future again. He said he'd been looking at local community college programs, had even emailed an advisor. When I told him how proud I was, he grew quiet for a moment and said, "You're the only one who's believed in me without asking for anything back." That sentence landed heavily. I didn't respond right away. He looked at me like he was seeing me differently, not as Richard's wife, but as someone who had become important to him in her own right. Later that evening, he handed me something. An envelope with a handmade thank you card inside. It was simple, thoughtful, and filled with words I didn't expect. He wrote about how much lighter the house felt, how I'd helped him feel less alone, how I'd treated him like a person instead of a broken thing. I was touched, maybe more than I should have been. I hugged him, naturally, instinctively. It was meant to be comforting, sincere, nothing more. But something shifted in the air. For a second it felt like time paused. The hug lingered just a moment too long, not inappropriate but different. Heavy, uncertain. When we pulled back, there was silence. He looked down, apologized quietly, saying he didn't mean to make things weird. I told him he didn't. I said emotions are messy and it's okay to feel close to someone who's been there for you. But that night, lying in bed, I couldn't ignore the feeling in my chest. Not guilt, just confusion. I hadn't crossed any lines. Neither had he. But it scared me how easily the lines could blur when comfort and loneliness mix. I cared for Jake deeply. I wanted him to succeed, to heal, to live fully. And I knew he saw me as more than just his stepmother now. Still, I reminded myself that feelings aren't facts. We're human. Sometimes we attach to people who show up when we need them most. That doesn't mean the attachment should grow into something else. It just means we have to be careful with each other's hearts. And in that moment, I realized the next step had to be clarity, for both our sakes. The next morning, I asked Jake if we could talk. He looked nervous, maybe expecting the worst, but I kept my tone calm. I told him I valued the bond we'd built, that I cared for him, and I was proud of how far he'd come. Then I said something I knew we both needed to hear. I reminded us both that we were family, and family needed clarity, especially when emotions got complicated. He nodded slowly, his eyes not quite meeting mine. I told him that what we shared, our conversations, the support, the comfort, was real and meaningful, but it needed to stay grounded in respect and boundaries. There was no accusation, no shame, just honesty. He listened quietly, then finally said, "I was confused. I think I needed someone so badly I started seeing you as more than you are. But I know where the line is. I don't want to lose this." I believed him. And I believed in his ability to process everything with maturity. What we had was never wrong, but it was a sign of how fragile people can be when they're searching for connection. I told him the best thing we could do was keep caring for each other in the right way. That meant encouraging growth, respecting space, and letting time do its job. Over the following weeks, Jake shifted again, but this time with a new kind of strength. He enrolled in community college, started classes, and found a rhythm of his own. He met a girl in one of his courses. He didn't say much about her, but the way he smiled when her name came up told me enough. I felt relief. Not because he had moved on from anything, but because he was finally moving forward. Our relationship settled into something steady and clear. We shared coffee in the mornings, light conversation in the evenings, and everything felt natural again, without tension, without second guesses. He had carved out his path and I had returned to mine. Richard noticed the change in both of us but never questioned it. There was nothing to question. We had navigated something delicate with care, and now the dust had settled. One evening, the three of us had dinner together, laughter filling the kitchen. Jake talked about his first college project, Richard chimed in with stories from work, and I simply watched them, feeling content, feeling peace. The past few months hadn't been simple, but they had been honest. That mattered more than anything. Later that night, I sat alone on the porch and thought about how connection can come from unexpected places. Not all love stories are romantic. Some are just stories of learning, healing, and choosing the right kind of love even when it's the harder choice. Jake had once been a quiet presence in my life, a reminder of what was lost. Now he was part of what had been rebuilt. And that, to me, was the real happy ending.